Have you ever experienced something so terrifying that it leaves an indelible mark on your soul? Imagine being a child, alone in your room at night, when a chilling presence begins to encroach upon your safe haven. In the summer of 2006, a 9-year-old faced a horror so profound that it defied all rational explanation. Every night, as he secretly played his video games, a sinister force began to manifest, pale, cadaverous hands emerging from the darkness, their dark fingers tapping and reaching out as if trying to snatch him into an abyss of dread. What began as a terrifying curiosity soon escalated into a living nightmare, with the boy discovering that the malevolent presence might be far closer than he ever imagined. In this harrowing tale, follow his descent into fear as he uncovers an ancient and malevolent secret buried within the very walls of his home. The nightmare doesn't end with a simple resolution, it leaves lingering shadows that follow him wherever he goes. Brace yourself for a story of horror that twists the boundaries of reality and imagination, and discover what happens when the past reaches out to claim its due. Will he uncover the truth behind the ghastly apparitions, or will he remain trapped in a cycle of terror forever? Stay tuned until the end, and prepare to be haunted. Before starting the story, be sure to like and subscribe to follow more terrifying stories. Let me make one thing clear, I don't believe that my family's house was haunted. At least, not in the traditional sense. But something sinister, something beyond explanation, targeted me during the summer of 2006. I was 9 years old, and like most kids my age, I was obsessed with video games. My mom, a single parent, worked long hours, and I knew the drill when it came to bedtime. She would always check on me to make sure I was asleep, so I had to be careful. That night was no different, or so I thought. It was one of those suffocating summer nights when the air felt thick and heavy, and every creak of the old house seemed louder in the stillness. I was lying in bed, my Game Boy hidden under the covers, its soft glow illuminating the fabric of my blanket. The sound was turned down so low that I could barely hear it, but it didn't matter, I was completely engrossed in the game. I kept one ear tuned to the hallway, just in case my mom decided to check on me again. Around 2 in the morning, when the world outside was dead silent, it happened. The door to my bedroom started to creak open, slowly, deliberately, as if someone was trying not to be heard. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately switched off the Game Boy, shoving it under my pillow. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, my body tensing as I waited for my mom's familiar footsteps or the soft sound of her voice. But there was nothing. Just the door, hanging slightly ajar, and the oppressive silence that followed. I opened one eye, just a sliver, to see what was going on. The door was partially open, exactly as I expected, but there was no one there. The hallway beyond was pitch black, an inky void that seemed to absorb all light. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the darkness, trying to make sense of it. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I strained to listen for any noise, footsteps, breathing, anything, but there was nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe my mom had cracked the door open to check on me and then walked away without closing it. Maybe she was standing just outside, waiting to catch me in the act. Or maybe it wasn't her at all. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging on longer than the last. The door remained ajar, a small but unsettling gap that seemed to mock me. I told myself to be brave, to get up and close the door, but something deep inside me resisted. It was an instinct, primal and raw, telling me that whatever was out there, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know. Finally, the fear of the unknown became too much to bear. I decided to get up and close the door, reasoning that if I did it quietly enough, I could avoid waking my mom, or whatever was out there. I moved slowly, carefully sliding my legs out from under the covers. The floor was cool against my bare feet as I inched toward the door, my eyes never leaving the dark gap. Just as I reached out to close it, the door suddenly stopped. It was as if an invisible force had taken hold of it, preventing me from moving it any further. I stood there, hand hovering in the air, my breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I considered calling out for my mom, but some deep, instinctual fear, kept me silent. That's when I saw it. A hand, pale as death, slowly emerged from the darkness. The skin was almost translucent, with veins visible beneath the surface, and the fingers were unnaturally long, ending in dark, jagged nails. It gripped the edge of the door with a deliberate slowness, as if it knew I was watching and wanted me to see every horrifying detail. The hand paused, holding the door open just a crack, and then another hand appeared, gripping the door lower down, near the handle. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the sight. The hands were eerily still, their fingers tapping lightly against the wood, as if impatiently waiting for something. I felt a scream rising in my chest, but I couldn't let it out. I was paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the overwhelming need to stay quiet, to avoid drawing the attention of whatever those hands belonged to. I stood there, trembling, every nerve in my body screaming at me to do something. But I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch as the hands slowly retreated, sliding back into the darkness of the hallway. The door began to close, inch by inch, until it finally clicked shut with a soft but decisive sound. For what felt like an eternity, I remained rooted to the spot, staring at the closed door. The room was dead silent once again, but I could still hear the faint echo of those fingers tapping against the wood, a sound that seemed to reverberate in my mind long after it had stopped. Finally, when I was sure that whatever had been there was gone, I stumbled back to my bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, my entire body shaking with fear. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again. But it didn't. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath along with me. It wasn't until the first light of dawn filtered through my window that I allowed myself to relax, if only a little. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to my mom. What could I say? That I'd seen something impossible? That I'd been too scared to even scream? She wouldn't have believed me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. Those hands, those awful, pale hands, had been right there, just inches away from me. And somehow, I knew that this was only the beginning. After that first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The memory of those pale hands stayed with me, lingering in the corners of my mind like a shadow that wouldn't go away. But as the day wore on, I managed to convince myself that it had just been a bad dream. Maybe I dozed off while playing my Game Boy, and my mind had conjured up something horrible in the haze between sleep and waking. It was easier to believe that than to confront the terrifying possibility that what I'd seen was real. By the time night fell again, I'd almost convinced myself that it was all in my head. Almost. I went through my usual bedtime routine, brushing my teeth and changing into my pajamas, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my stomach. My mom kissed me goodnight as she always did, her warm, familiar presence a comfort that I clung to desperately. But as soon as she left the room, closing the door softly behind her, the fear began to creep back in. I stared at the door, half expecting it to open on its own like the night before. But it stayed shut, the room bathed in the soft glow of my bedside lamp. I told myself I was being silly. There was nothing to be afraid of. Whatever had happened last night, whether it was a dream or not, was over. I was safe. But that night, I couldn't bring myself to pick up my Game Boy. The thought of distracting myself, of losing focus, made me too nervous. Instead, I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the door, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the window made me jump. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the tension building with every passing minute. Then, around 2 in the morning, just like the night before, it happened. The door creaked open. Slowly, deliberately. My heart stopped. This time, I knew I wasn't dreaming. I froze, my eyes wide as I stared at the widening gap. The hallway beyond was dark, a blackness that seemed even deeper than before, like an endless void. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to close my eyes, to hide under the covers, to do anything but look. But I couldn't tear my gaze away. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The door remained partially open, and the darkness beyond it was still and silent. I could feel my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, my entire body trembling with fear. "Mom?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper, the sound almost lost in the silence. I knew it couldn't be her, but I was desperate for any kind of explanation, any reason to believe that this was all just some terrible mistake. No response. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. I called out again, louder this time, my voice cracking with fear. "Mom? Is that you?" And then I saw it. A hand, pale as death, reached around the edge of the door. The same hand as the night before, its long fingers curling around the wood, nails dark and jagged. My heart hammered in my chest as the hand slowly tightened its grip, holding the door open just a crack. The skin was almost translucent, the veins beneath it pulsing with a sickly blue tint. But this time, it wasn't alone. Another hand appeared, lower down on the door, gripping the edge just below the first. And then another. And another. For hands, identical in their unnatural pallor, their fingers tapping lightly against the wood as if waiting for something, or someone. They remained still, no movement beyond the subtle flexing of those long, bony fingers. Panic surged through me, cold and paralyzing. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. I was trapped in my own fear, unable to do anything but watch as those hands lingered at the edge of the door, their presence growing more menacing with each passing second. "Mom?" I whispered one last time, my voice trembling. But deep down, I knew my mother wasn't the one behind that door. And then, in the silence, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It took me a moment to realize what it was, tapping. The fingers were tapping against the wood, like someone drumming their nails on a table while waiting. The sound was light but rhythmic, and each tap sent a jolt of terror through me. Suddenly, the hands retreated, disappearing into the darkness beyond the door. For a moment, I thought it was over. I even let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. But then, with a sharp, violent motion, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the room, loud and final, like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door was closed, just as it had been before, but the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread, still clung to me like a suffocating blanket. For the second night in a row, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hands, those long, pale fingers tapping against the door. I lay in bed, wide awake, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, bringing with it a sense of uneasy calm. In the daylight, everything felt different. The fear that had gripped me so tightly in the darkness seemed distant, almost irrational. But I knew better. I knew that whatever had visited me those 2 nights wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. And I was certain it would come back. But I couldn't tell my mom. She wouldn't understand, and I didn't want to worry her. So I kept it to myself, burying the fear deep down, hoping that if I ignored it, it would go away. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning. 2 days had passed since the terrifying events of the second night, and I had convinced myself that I was safe. I avoided my Game Boy, trying to focus on anything else that might keep me distracted. Daylight was my refuge, a shield against the creeping terror that seemed to come alive in the dark. But as night fell, my fear returned, gnawing at me like a persistent itch. That night, my mom had to work late again. She kissed me goodnight and left for her shift, leaving me alone in the house. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that the hands from before wouldn't come back. But as the clock inched closer to 2 in the morning, a chill settled over me. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the door. The room was still, save for the occasional creak of the old house settling. I could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of leaves outside the window. I tried to convince myself that nothing would happen, but the memory of those pale hands was a dark shadow that loomed large in my mind. Around 2 o'clock, the familiar sound came. The door creaked open, just as it had on those other nights. My heart raced, and I gripped the edge of my blanket, willing myself to stay calm. I could hear the soft, rhythmic tapping of fingers against the door, a sound that had become synonymous with fear. I watched in horror as the door slowly opened, revealing the same darkness that had haunted me before. The hands appeared again, their pale, almost ghostly fingers curling around the edge of the door. This time, there were even more of them, at least 10 hands, their fingers tapping impatiently, as if they were waiting for me to do something. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain still. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But the sight of those hands, the way they moved so deliberately, made it impossible to think rationally. Just as I was about to call out for my mom, a new, more disturbing realization dawned on me. The tapping sound was coming from inside my room, not just from the door. It was as if the hands had multiplied and were now scattered around the room, their presence an ever-present threat. I could hear the faint, eerie tapping coming from different corners of the room, each one adding to the growing sense of dread. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound. I lay there, frozen, as the tapping grew louder and more insistent. The hands seemed to be everywhere at once, their ghostly presence an unrelenting torment. The sound of my mom's voice, soft and reassuring, broke through the fear that had gripped me. SSSSH. Just ignore it, Josh. Sleep. Her voice was soothing, but there was something unsettling about it. It didn't sound like her, there was a cold, detached quality to it that made my blood run cold. I turned to look at her, hoping to find comfort in her presence, but what I saw made my heart skip a beat. Her arm was draped over me, but it was the same pale, ghostly color as the hands I had seen. The dark nails on her fingers were identical to those that had haunted me before. My body froze in terror, unable to move or make a sound. The realization that my mother might be part of the nightmare was too much to comprehend. Tears streamed down my face as I lay there, paralyzed with fear. The tapping continued, the ghostly hands still moving around the room, their presence a constant reminder of the terror that had taken hold of me. I tried to call out again, but my voice was a mere whisper, barely audible over the sound of the tapping. The night seemed to stretch on forever. I lay there, trembling, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be happening. Was my mom really part of the intruders? Were these hands somehow connected to her? The question swirled around in my mind, adding to the confusion and fear that already gripped me. When morning finally came, I woke to find my mom getting ready for work, as if nothing had happened. She acted as though the night had been perfectly normal, her demeanor completely unchanged. I wanted to ask her about what had happened, to confront her about the strange, ghostly arm, but the words wouldn't come. I was too terrified, too confused to say anything. The fear of the previous nights lingered, a dark cloud hanging over me. I returned to my room, determined to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But the tapping continued, faint but persistent, no matter where I went. It followed me, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. From that night on, I couldn't escape the fear that had taken root in my mind. I started barricading my door every night, no matter where I was. I needed to feel safe, to believe that I could protect myself from whatever was lurking out there. The sound of the tapping, the ghostly presence of those hands, remained with me, a constant, haunting reminder of the terror that had invaded my life. And every night, as I lay in bed, I listened for the sound of those hands, the tapping that had become a chilling symphony of fear. I knew that the nightmare was far from over. Days turned into weeks, and the fear that had taken hold of me didn't fade. Each night, I lay in bed with my door barricaded, listening for the faint, ghostly tapping that had become a constant part of my life. The tapping was relentless, a haunting rhythm that seemed to echo through my nightmares and my waking hours. I was trapped in a cycle of terror, unable to escape the fear that had become my reality. One evening, as my mom prepared dinner in the kitchen, I sat in my room, my back pressed against the barricaded door. The tapping had been particularly persistent that night, and I was on edge, my nerves frayed from the constant anxiety. I tried to focus on my homework, but every noise, every creak of the house, made me jump. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around my room, the familiar shadows dancing on the walls like malevolent spirits. My heart raced as I imagined those pale, ghostly hands reaching out from the darkness. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered, persistent and unnerving. Then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a knock at my bedroom door. It was different from the usual tapping. This was a deliberate, measured knock, as if someone were trying to get my attention. I froze, my eyes wide with terror. The knocking came again, louder this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to see what was happening. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, the metal cold and unyielding against my skin. I hesitated, my fear almost overwhelming. But curiosity and the need for answers drove me to open the door just a crack. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. Standing in the hallway, just beyond the crack of the door, were those same ghostly hands. They were no longer confined to the door. They were now reaching out into the hallway, their fingers stretching and curling as if they were trying to pull something, or someone, toward them. The sight was enough to make me gasp in horror. The hands seemed to be waiting, as if they were expecting me to come out. I wanted to slam the door shut and run, but something held me in place. The hands continued to stretch toward me, their dark nails gleaming in the dim light of the hallway. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, a voice that was eerily familiar. It was my mom's voice, but it was distorted, hollow, and filled with an unnatural chill. "Josh, come out. It's time for you to face the truth." My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the voice. The sound was unmistakable, but there was something wrong, something that made my skin crawl. The hands continued their relentless reach, the tapping growing louder and more insistent. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? Why was my mom's voice coming from beyond the door, accompanied by those horrifying hands? I needed answers, but the fear was almost paralyzing. With trembling hands, I slowly closed the door and backed away, my mind whirling with questions. I sat on my bed, my heart racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had taken over my life. The tapping continued, more persistent than ever, but I could no longer bring myself to look. The next morning, I confronted my mom. I was trembling as I asked her about the voice I had heard and the hands that had appeared at my door. Her face went pale, and she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "What are you talking about, Josh?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine confusion. "There's nothing there. It's just your imagination." But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided looking directly at me. I wanted to believe her, but the fear I had experienced was too real, too intense. I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, I decided to investigate further. I waited until my mom went to bed and then carefully removed the barricade from my door. I opened it just a crack, peering into the darkness of the hallway. The tapping had stopped, and the hallway was empty. The air was still and silent, but the sense of dread lingered. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. I walked slowly, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the sinister presence that had haunted me. As I approached the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange, a small, old-fashioned key hanging from a nail on the wall. It was tarnished and covered in dust, and it seemed out of place. I reached for the key, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. As I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. I turned the key over in my hand, trying to understand its significance. It seemed to radiate an eerie energy, and I could feel its weight, both physical and emotional. The key was my only clue, my only connection to the nightmare that had taken over my life. I had to find out what it opened, what secrets it might reveal. But as I stood there in the dark hallway, clutching the key, I knew that whatever lay ahead would be far more terrifying than anything I had faced before. And so, with a mixture of dread and determination, I set out to uncover the truth behind the haunting presence that had invaded my life. I knew that the answers lay somewhere in the shadows, and I was ready to face whatever awaited me, no matter how horrifying it might be. The small, tarnished key felt heavy in my hand as I clutched it tightly, the chill of its metal seeping into my bones. The night was still, but the sense of foreboding in the house seemed almost palpable. My heart raced as I contemplated the key's purpose. What was it meant to unlock? And why had it appeared now, when the terror seemed to be reaching its peak? Determined to uncover the truth, I began a meticulous search of the house, focusing on areas that seemed out of place or unexplored. I started with the attic, a place I had always avoided due to its dark, musty corners and the eerie silence that pervaded it. The attic door creaked open with a shuddering groan as I approached it. Dust fell from the hinges, and the musty smell of old belongings filled the air. With a flashlight in one hand and the key in the other, I climbed the narrow, rickety stairs. The light beam cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes piled high, and cobwebs stretching from corner to corner. I scanned the room, searching for anything that might hint at the key's purpose. My flashlight's beam fell upon an old, ornate trunk tucked away in the corner. The trunk was covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Something about it felt significant, almost as if it were waiting for me to discover it. My pulse quickened as I approached, the key growing colder in my hand. I examined the trunk carefully, noting its intricate carvings and the heavy, rusted lock that secured it. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and with a deep breath, I turned it. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the attic. I hesitated for a moment, bracing myself for what lay within. As I lifted the lid, a cloud of dust erupted into the air, making me cough. Inside the trunk were old letters, photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I pulled out the journal, its cover cracked and worn. It was filled with handwritten notes, dates, and descriptions that seemed to detail events from long ago. Flipping through the pages, I found a section that described a series of strange occurrences in the house, nightmarish visions, eerie noises, and unexplained phenomena. The final entries were the most chilling. They spoke of an ancient ritual performed by previous occupants of the house, a ritual that was said to summon malevolent spirits if it was disturbed. The journal revealed that the ritual was meant to open a gateway to another realm, a realm inhabited by entities that thrived on fear and despair. The hands I had seen, the ghostly taps, the distorted voice, it all made sense now. The spirits that had haunted me were not merely passing through, they were tied to this house, bound by a ritual gone wrong. As I read, a cold draft swept through the attic, making the pages of the journal flutter. I could feel the presence of the spirits growing stronger, their malignant energy filling the room. The tapping sound began again, louder and more urgent than before. It was coming from everywhere at once, a relentless, maddening noise that seemed to close in on me. Desperate for answers, I continued to read. The journal detailed how the spirits could be banished, but it required a specific ritual, one that involved a significant personal sacrifice and a confrontation with the entities themselves. The description was vague, but it was clear that facing the spirits and breaking the ritual's hold was the only way to end the terror. With a mix of determination and dread, I decided to perform the ritual described in the journal. I gathered the necessary items, candles, incense, and specific words of incantation, scavenging what I could from the attic and the rest of the house. The ritual had to be performed at midnight, when the spirits were believed to be the most active. As the clock struck 12, I set up the ritual in the center of the attic, lighting the candles and incense as instructed. I recited the incantation, my voice trembling as I spoke the ancient words. The temperature in the room dropped, and a sense of oppressive darkness seemed to envelop me. The tapping grew louder, a cacophony of ghostly sounds that filled the attic. I continued the ritual, my voice growing steadier as I recited each line. The spirits seemed to respond, their presence growing more tangible. I could almost see their shadowy forms, their ghostly hands reaching out as if trying to stop me. I fought the urge to falter, focusing on the ritual and its purpose. As I reached the final incantation, the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. The candles flickered violently, and the temperature surged, creating a whirlwind of energy. The tapping ceased abruptly, and a profound silence settled over the attic. The oppressive darkness lifted, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I collapsed on the floor, exhausted but hopeful. The journal's final entry had promised that the spirits would be banished and that the house would be free from their influence. I hoped that it was true, that the nightmare had finally ended. In the days that followed, I noticed a marked change. The tapping stopped, and the oppressive fear that had haunted me began to dissipate. The house felt lighter, more peaceful. I was able to sleep without barricading my door, and the constant fear that had gripped me slowly faded. The ordeal had left its mark on me, but I had faced my fears and uncovered the truth behind the haunting. The knowledge that the spirits were gone brought a sense of closure, and while I would never forget the terror I had experienced, I knew that I had conquered it. As for the key and the journal, I decided to keep them hidden, a reminder of the darkness that had once plagued my home. I knew that they were a part of my past, a chapter in my life that had shaped who I was. And though the fear was no longer a constant presence, the memory of those dark nights would remain with me, a haunting reminder of the battle I had fought and won.